Good evening and welcome to the Natural History Institute's speaker series. I also want to extend a welcome to those folks who are watching on the live stream tonight, so welcome. My name is Bob Ellis. I'm the Executive Director here at the Natural History Institute, and our mission is to connect people to nature, the natural world, for the well-being of humans and the rest of nature. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to make a few quick announcements. The restrooms are around that corner and then over in that direction, as well as the drinking fountain. And I also want to thank Rob Milligan, who's the videographer for tonight's event. A video of this talk will be posted on our YouTube channel, where you can find many videos that Rob has produced for us. Please subscribe when you watch, because that provides us with some income. And to that end, we are a charitable organization dedicated to serving our community. We exist through public support. Therefore, I want to thank everybody who donated through the Eventbrite website whenever you registered for the event. Those donations make a big difference for us and our ability to bring free and world-class programs to Prescott, Arizona. And if you did not donate and would like to, there's a donation box just around the corner over there, as well as a QR code where you can make that donation, that tax-deductible donation. And so you might be wondering, well, Bob, what kind of programs do my donations support? Well, I'm glad you asked, because on June the 1st in this very room, there'll be a speaker series talk called Born to Run, Pronghorn in North Central Arizona. And then on June the 10th from 8:30 to 4:30, we are hosting a workshop up at the Pavilion at Thumb Butte, and that workshop's title is Homecoming, a Journey of Reconnection, and it's facilitated by Carol Russell and Grace Burford. Today, more than ever, it seems to me, our lives are enmeshed in systems of juggernaut proportions, leaving us at times lonely, powerless, even hopeless. The unseen consequences of artificial intelligence, social media echo chambers, political polarization, climate crisis. What to do? What to do? Tonight's speaker has some ideas about what one might do, where one might turn to find strength, hope, solace. Dr. Tom Fleischner has the credibility to do that. He is the Senior Advisor here at the Natural History Institute and Director Emeritus. He's also Faculty Emeritus at Prescott College. He's edited 2 anthologies of importance on the importance of natural history, one of them titled Nature, Love, Medicine, Essays on Wildness and Wellness, and another book, The Way of Natural History. And recently, Tom addressed the United Nations Science Summit on the importance of natural history. He is also an elected fellow at the Linnean Society of London. In 2020, Tom co-edited a special issue of the Ecopsychology Journal on reciprocal healing, nature, health, and wild vitality that grew out of a national conference convened by the Natural History Institute on the topic. And of course, the list of his accomplishments go on and on and on. And on top of that, I count him as a friend, a colleague, a kindred spirit, and as my 20-year-old son would say, he's just a good dude. So please join me in welcoming Tom.
Thank you so much, Bob, for that very kind and very thoughtful introduction. So it's always a great pleasure and a great honor to be here in the Natural History Institute, still leading the charge in the world for the importance of attentiveness to nature. It's great to be here, and I'm honored also to be a part of this series this spring and early summer on reciprocal healing. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to those who are beaming in from afar via the electrons. Also I'd like to thank this unusual spring monsoon that is happening here in northern Arizona, which is just remarkable and reminds us of how little we actually know and can predict, and how attentiveness can serve us as we try to unravel these mysteries as we celebrate them. So what I have in mind here for us to do together tonight is a couple of things, basically. So I'll give you the punchlines in advance. One is just kind of reviewing what do we really mean by natural history. It's a term that in some ways has fallen on hard times and sometimes is misunderstood. And then to, more importantly, make the case for why this practice of natural history is good for us and is good for the world, and how those two goodnesses are intertwined with one another. So that's kind of where we're going. So I'm going to start with the kinship part of this, and I'm going to start by reading a short. I was part of a project that was coordinated by the Center for Humans and Nature, a Chicago or Illinois-based organization, and actually it's a 5-volume set of books, which is on the stage if you'd like to glance at it afterwards. But I was very honored to be part of this project, and I'm just going to start by reading a short little bit from my essay, actually the ending of my essay. Intentional changes to our consciousness, simple yet profound shifts in how we speak and think, what we choose to pay attention to, and that we do choose to pay attention. Help us embrace more of the world, understand it more fully, and feel it with greater vibrancy. And this is quite literally what we were born to do. The evolution of our species, from a naked, vulnerable biped on the savanna to successful inhabitant of virtually every habitat on the planet, selected for our immense capacity for attentiveness. We were not the fastest, the strongest, nor the most agile, but our highly attuned eyes and ears and our inquisitive sense of touch, combined with the new twist of our developing cleverness, our facility for memory, and our innovative aptitude for passing knowledge on, story by story. Thus, we could adapt and learn without waiting for our genes, that's genes with a G, to change. We are built to pay attention to the world around us. A sense of kinship is a natural byproduct of this evolutionary heritage. It is well past time to reawaken to our senses, to reactivate our innate skill at attentiveness, our great natural capacity for being kin. Animate beings of the earth reaching out for connection. Let's just say it. We need to love this world. Natural history opens the door. Thank you. So, love is going to be a theme threaded through tonight's presentation. And so just a couple of points here. Loving the world, as you see here, in my mind, is every bit as important as grieving for the world. And as Bob mentioned in his introduction, you know, we live in challenging times. It's very easy to be daunted and to be let down on any given day. And yet I think it's really, really essential for our own sanity, but also for getting things done to make things better, to remind ourselves of what a wondrous place it is that we live on this planet, and not to solely, the grieving is important too, make no mistake, but it's not the only important practice for us to do. This ties in with an idea that many of you may be familiar with, this notion of biophilia, which was a term that was coined by the legendary biologist E.O. Wilson, who passed away just a couple years ago. He defined this as the innate urge to affiliate with other forms of life, and proposed that all humans have this a sense of biophilia, this urge of affiliation. So simply put, loving the world matters. That's part of the case I'm trying to make here tonight. So what fosters love of the world? How does that happen? And so I would suggest that there are endless opportunities for love. There's endless handholds, you might say, or places and ways that we can connect with the world around us. And each of us has our own sort of list of these and places and critters and people and so on that matter to us. And I'm just showing you here a few of mine. And there's could be many, many more, excuse me. So just flying through some of these, and you might be imagining what images you might put up in such a thing. But it's just sometimes just remarkable to remember what a just phenomenally curious and beautiful world we live in. And sometimes these moments are simply moments that you happen to be fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time, like we see here. Other times there's much more still presences that we can return to time and time again. Sometimes we share these kind of experiences in these places with compatriots. Sometimes we see some of these other kin experiencing it with their compatriots or not. So we live in a beautiful world, and it's, of course, that's not the whole story, but it's important to remind ourselves that that is in fact true. So I've come, I'm going to get in a moment to a little bit more formal ideas of what we mean by natural history, but I've in recent years taken to referring to natural history oftentimes as the practice of falling in love with the world. That's what we do when we're practicing natural history. A biologist friend, Chris Normant, once used the term sympathetic observation, which I really like that idea, that we're empirically observing the world, but we're being honest about that, and it generates a sense of sympathy and empathy with the world. So, what do we mean by this, sometimes, to some people, awkward or clumsy term, natural history? So, for many, I used to ask people a lot, like, when you hear that term, what do you think of? And so often it was like, well, when I was in 6th grade, I went to the Natural History Museum in New York, or what have you. And so it was often about lifeless exhibits, phenomenal exhibits, but it was about things that used to exist more than something present. And so the term natural history was coined about 2,000 years ago by a Roman philosopher named Pliny the Elder. And in Latin, that was called Historia Naturalis. And it actually, interestingly enough, interesting side note, is that was the first ever attempt at an encyclopedia. It was a multi-volume set that attempted to put into writing everything that humanity knew about everything. And it's still in print, actually, and some, or at least condensed versions of it are, and some parts of it seem like they were incredibly prescient, and some of them are easy to laugh at from our perspective 2,000 years later. But the point I want to make is that historia in Latin, as well as in Latin-based languages like Spanish, has two meanings. It means history in the way we typically think of that, but it means more directly, it means story. So Historia Naturalis, or natural history in its earliest incarnation, literally meant the story of nature. So that includes things going on now, not just what used to happen. It's not just dinosaurs, et cetera, et cetera. But that is a very open-ended invitation to embrace and to understand the world, because, of course, at any given moment, in any given place, there is an infinite variety of stories we could pay attention to. Some of them are stunningly beautiful, some of them are grisly and troublesome to watch, like this predation. Sometimes it includes, things like parasites. There's all sorts of visions, but we choose which stories we pay attention to in the practice of natural history. There's many, many different people have attempted to define it, and I'm not going to focus on all of these things, but notice that some of the commonalities here is like the close observation of organisms, observing plants and animals directly. It's a practice of observation. So my own definition, which is I think on the wall out there, is this, which I came up with some time ago, a practice of intentional, focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world. That the more than human world means humans embedded in a larger world, so it's not excluding humans, guided by honesty and accuracy. That last part is so that we don't just project what we think nature is all about, but we really pay attention to what is really going on. So that's the right answer when the quiz comes. So boil that down to its essence, and what it amounts to is that natural history is the practice of paying attention. And I want to emphasize that word practice, that natural history, I would sometimes say, is a verb, not a noun. There's much information that is generated. There's specimens in museum shelves. All of that stuff is really important aspects of natural history. But at its root, natural history is a practice. It's a doing. It's an observing directly nature. And along those lines, if you accept this kind of more expansive definition of what natural history is, we are all, every person in this world, every person that has ever lived in this world, is built to practice natural history. And I mean that in a pretty literal sense, as the little reading sort of alluded to a bit, that in fact, there's papers written in this book that's referenced here, discusses how literally the structure of human psyche and the structure even of our body's shape and function and so on, where our ears are, our eyes, everything about us is designed to pay attention to the world around us. Our survival in that savanna habitat where we started depended completely on that. We needed to be able to distinguish danger from food, predator from prey. We needed to be able to make distinctions, and that is still what natural historians do. So we're literally built to practice natural history, and in my work over many years, what I have seen is that readiness of people to be able to practice natural history, even if they've never done it since they were a child, is right there, and it comes back very easily. And I imagine some of you have experienced that sort of rejuvenation. And by the way, speaking of children, I would say that if anybody doubts that this is an innate human tendency to pay attention to the world, I would challenge you to look at any small child from any culture, anywhere in the world, and see what they do. And we're just built as machines for paying attention to the world and tasting and touching and feeling and processing the world in that kind of way. And our cultural then constructs sort of train that out of us, unfortunately. So organizations like this one are a lot about trying to bring back that and keep it ingrained in the hearts of our lives. And like I say, all people from all sorts of cultural backgrounds, we do this, we enjoy this. This was an interesting thing. There's a book that came out about 5 years ago that got a lot of play in the biology world on the evolution of beauty by a biologist from Yale, and this line really caught my attention. Bird watching might be among the very first functions of human mind, which again is this idea that this is really what we're built to do. So a little more evidence of this idea that natural history, the importance of love and natural history, and we see this coming, this recognition from many different directions. So John Tarrant is a Buddhist psychologist. I think Bob actually mentioned him in his recent newsletter. who said that attention is the most basic form of love. You know, what we choose to pay attention to is an act of love. Coming from a different direction, Marge Piercy, a famous poet and novelist, just flat out said, attention is love. So this idea reverberates from many different disciplinary backgrounds. So the history of natural history, I already mentioned Pliny the Elder, who lived just after the time of Christ, is, as you already know, who sort of coined the term and who we often consider to be the sort of where this started. But we can go further back. So somebody like Aristotle, who is often considered the father of zoology, among many, many other things. But you look at his work, and he was very carefully paying attention and laying some of the groundwork in Western culture for the practice of natural history and the sort of gathering of information and having a collective approach to how we do this and how we try to understand the world. But perhaps more importantly, if we go further back yet and look at any hunter-gatherer culture anywhere in the world, this was all about the practice of natural history. We don't often use that term in regards to that, but that is what people everywhere have done because we've had to. We have to know when the food plants are ripening, where they are, what's the seasonality, when do the animals that we might want to hunt come through our valley, et cetera, et cetera. All these are fundamental natural history questions. So natural history, then, is the oldest continuous human endeavor. In fact, you could say that there have never been people on this planet without the practice of natural history. It is part of who we are. And yet, it's also true that there has never been a moment, a historical moment, when a smaller percentage of humanity practiced natural history as is true today, because of the factors we've already talked about, of people sort of being told by cultural constructs that that's what you do as a kid, but it's not what you do as an adult or what have you. So people have too much, sort of, it's been marginalized. And it actually was marginalized in the last century a lot in the biological sciences in academia because of sort of a fascination with theorizing and so on. And so the fundamental natural history in which it was built oftentimes was disregarded, but that, I'm happy to say, is changing. So why does it matter? Well, and I think the children in the forest are one inkling of that answer. But looking at that a couple different ways. In a different context, quite a few years ago, I wrote this sentence, we are what we pay attention to. And I kept coming back to that, and I realized I had sort of inadvertently uttered something wise and true. Because the more I've thought about it, the more I think this really is true. What we pay attention to, what we fill our consciousness with, is who we are. So what do we pay attention to? What does our culture choose to pay attention to? And how do those things that we choose to pay attention to serve us and nurture us? But at any given moment, wherever you are, there's always different choices. But, well, first, before going on, this has become even more heightened because of the advent of screens. And I'm not in any way removing myself from this. We spend a lot of time on our screens, and I would also hasten to add that there's some wonderful reasons for doing so, including natural history reasons. All sorts of apps that help us identify things, listen to bird songs, all that stuff is wonderful. So I'm not standing here as a Luddite saying, smash all your computers or whatever. That would be a bit hypocritical. But it is something to be aware of and how it has affected us. A good friend of mine, Laura Sewell, has written about how this has affects human psyche in many ways, partly just because it's a two-dimensional, we're paying attention to a two-dimensional surface instead of a three-dimensional world, and that literally, because of something called neuroplasticity, changes our brain so that we don't see as much depth after a while. But the good news is it can be changed back. So, as I say, we have choices about what we pay attention to. So another little framework of thinking about why does natural history matter, I've sort of kind of, for myself, sort of simplified it in this sort of way of thinking of these sort of three prongs. That it's important as the foundations of the natural sciences. It is important, as we'll see in a moment, for conservation. And I think increasingly, to me, it's most important is how it affects our basic humanity, who we are as people. But let's look at the science first. Suffice it to say that in academic sciences, for sure, there's a sort of an elevation in the importance of theory. So that's what gets you tenure at a big university, et cetera, et cetera. That's what gets you publications. And I think theory is fantastic and exciting, and that's a part of what the human mind has figured out how to do. But what is often not recognized is that the ecological theories that have had the biggest impact on how we understand the world have all come from the minds of very committed field naturalists who are actually really paying attention to what is going on, not from people who just sit in their offices. This is E.O. Wilson here, who we heard from before, looking for ants. But even something as basic as the idea that the unifying principle of biology, of evolution through natural selection, both Alfred Russel Wallace, who there was a talk about here a while back, I was sorry to miss, and Charles Darwin, the co-discoverers or thinkers of that idea, were both incredible field naturalists who spent years in the field, and that's where they got their ideas about how the world worked. Or some of you are familiar with this idea, the equilibrium theory of island biogeography ended up being, among other things, it's about why is there different levels of diversity on different islands in the world of different sizes and distances and senses of isolation. That sounds like a bit of a arcane idea, except that it ended up having a lot of relevance for conservation, because those we can think of shrinking habitats of forest, for example, as an island of a different size, and this has helped think about it. So the two people, Robert MacArthur and again E.O. Wilson, he seems to keep popping up, were the field naturalists who figured that out. There's another idea that might be a little less familiar, but this idea of keystone species and how ecological communities are structured. These fellows, Bob Payne and Paul Dayton, who are the ones who came out, again, a very dedicated field naturalists. So what about conservation? How we protect the world? So first of all, and this seems pretty obvious, but sometimes is forgotten, is that we can't protect the world if we don't know what is out there. If we don't know who lives where and when, how do we come up with any kind of priority? How do we know what piece of land is important or needs to be protected? How do we know, if we don't know how many birds are in the world of a particular species, how do we know if it needs protection, et cetera, et cetera? Indeed, the U.S. Endangered Species Act, one of the most brilliant conservation laws anywhere in the world, that's the first thing that has to happen, is to, quote unquote, petition the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that a species it deserves protection, as you have to present a whole lot of natural history information about that species, how many there are, where they are, so on. So in very, very fundamental ways, natural history is fundamental to the practice of conservation. And this has been true for a long time. These are three sort of icons of conservation in the U.S., from left to right, John Wesley Powell, Aldo Leopold, and Rachel Carson, again, all very, very dedicated naturalists. Excuse me one sec. Okay, shifting gears only slightly, Bob mentioned I had the honor of speaking to a United Nations Science Summit about the importance of natural history. And the UN, through a process of many, many years, came up and with agreed upon 17 sustainable development goals. And there's a whole literature about this. And if you can stop and think for a minute, what level of compromise, deep thought, careful negotiation to get all the governments of the world to come up and agree on these things. So these have been seriously vetted, let's just say. And so one of the points I made is that these 5 of those goals in particular were directly supported by the practice of natural history. And if you're interested, I can direct you to learning more about what all these say. But I also made the point that all 17 of them were actually supported by the practice of natural history, some in less direct ways, because the practice of natural history creates a mindset and a sympathy in the public towards the practice of sustainability and building a sustainable world. And that works something like this. So I would suggest that conservation, in any case, always involves interaction between these 3 sort of intersecting realms of science, values, and policy. And in some cases, let's say the spotted owl controversy or whatever, one of them might be more visible than others, or the science, oh, well, now we've figured out there's this many owls, or the values, like, the logging communities are up in arms, whatever. But they're always there whether we see them or not. And then the policy emerges out of those things. So natural history directly influences that in these 2 ways, I think, in that the natural history, in the ways we've already gone over, informs the science that undergirds conservation, but it inspires the values that, again, are sympathetic to and supportive of conservation or sustainability. And hopefully then the policies that we create to govern ourselves that emerge in that way are then oriented towards, and the ways that we would like in terms of preserving natural values. So one thing that ties into this is that people are motivated by feelings more than by facts. And there's a growing psychological literature about this. And so too often in the realm of conservation, scientists have felt like if we just keep throwing more and more and more information, they'll finally get it. But that's really not the way our minds work, and that's not the way public opinion is created. And so things that make us feel tend to be more important. And also different emotions act in different ways. So as the famous scientist J.K. Rowling, in her scientific paper, is that love and fear operate in different ways. And I would suggest, and I'm not alone in this, that that love is what fuels our commitment for the long term to building a better world. Fear can be very useful in immediate senses. Your kid runs out into the street and you run out and grab them or what have you, but it doesn't generate a long-term commitment to building the kind of world that we all hope to live in. But natural history does do that because of how it helps us love the world and care for the world. And I wanted to make this point here in this beautiful building with the art gallery right through the wall, that with this beautiful jewelry show right now, is that natural history is this integrative whole. It isn't just science. It is something larger than science alone, although it has a strong scientific core, but it's also includes the arts and the humanities, literature, storytelling, and so on. And that, of course, is central to what the Natural History Institute does with integrating art, science, and humanities. A poet I love, Patty Ann Rogers, said this: without artistic expression, any fact remains alien, unpossessed, with no reverberations in the soul. Or Rachel Carson, who we mentioned a moment ago, who won the National Book Award for her wonderful book, The Sea Around Us, in her acceptance speech for that highest of literary honors, said no one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry. I love that. So here's perhaps a odd statement to make, which is that environment, and by that I mean the word environment, is part of the problem for environmentalists. So what do I mean by that? So that term, when you hear that term, it is such an abstraction. It is not, it is sort of dead. It's very, very vapid. However, natural history is the solution to that problem, because natural history kind of reanimates the world. It brings the world to life. It fills the world in with actual living, breathing organisms, with flowers blooming, with landscapes that we can walk in that are full of color, and isn't just a vague notion like quote unquote environment. So if I can figure out how to get this up. So along those lines, we understand the world through stories. And of course, natural history is the story or stories of nature. There's a children's fable written by one of my favorite authors, Barry Lopez, that came out, though it's 30 years old now. And one of the characters, Badger Woman, that you see here, says, sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. So what kind of stories do we need, and what kind of stories do we share? Well, what kind of stories does ecological science tend to share with people? It oftentimes is not the stories that compel us to love the world and to care for the world. And I also hasten to add that I'm all of, supportive of and recognize the importance of this sort of publication too, but too often we leave it at that. The scientific community leaves it at that and expects people to then get on the train. Whereas the most compelling ecological stories, the things that really grab people's attention, are the stories that are rooted in natural history. Again, living, breathing organisms that have, and it might be predation, and it might be, raising a young on a remote island, or it might be a dangerous predator, whatever it may be. So also, natural history provides, I think, a basis for moral or ethical behavior. What you see on the screen there is probably the single most famous sentence in environmental ethics, by Aldo Leopold's famous essay, The Land Ethic. And that sentence right there is the land ethic in one sentence. It's part of a 30 or so page essay. But a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. I guess it's two sentences. So I love the clarity of that. But he goes on to say in the same essay that we can be ethical only in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in. It's a whole lot easier to love, feel, understand something that we see, that we observe directly with ourselves, whether it's those dolphins or whether it's the flower blooming in a crack in the city sidewalk, is different than just a theory or an abstraction or a mathematical formula. So a number of years ago, Bob mentioned that I taught at Prescott College for a long time, and I taught a natural history field course every spring. And one year I just started, it was year after year you would see people be transformed by this experience. And so I started on the last day just asking people, how have you changed as a person because of learning how to identify plants or watch birds or whatever they had gotten turned on by. And these were some of the kinds of things that came up. And so I ended up, after doing this for a number of years, I sort of wrote something about the social field marks of natural history, like what are characteristics of groups of people that do natural history. So just really quickly, certainly one of the most prevalent and probably important ones was this idea of humility, which is very easy to feel when you're on a gravel bar with a grizzly track that's fresh. Or if you're out in a boat and suddenly you're accompanied by the biggest aquatic predator around. Or if, like my friend, good friend of the Institute, Harry Green, who's a world expert on snakes, you know, when he sees something like this, he goes towards it, whereas I would certainly run the other way. But humility, again, easy to come by. And doesn't the world need more humility? Just think if all of our political leaders were encountering these kinds of organisms. But it's not just big, fierce animals. It's also places like this where we feel something reverberating in the ancient sense of time, or just a different sort of consciousness than our own. Or we feel, we hear a sudden, you know, as a animal we didn't know was there suddenly is right next to us. Or something like this. This is when you see ice like this that is this blue, it means that it was at the bottom of a glacier for a long, long time, so much so that all the air was compressed out of it, because what makes it white is is the air bubbles in it. And suddenly, only very rarely do they pop up like this. Natural history also inspires us, and I mean this in kind of a literal way, because the word inspire, remember, literally means to breathe in. So the practice of natural history helps us breathe in the world. And one thing that was really striking to me over the years is how it engenders joy. And as I once wrote that I realized after a while that at the end of a day, of so many days in the field, especially when it was shared with other people, like a NHI program or a class or what have you, that my face would always be sore from smiling and laughing so much, and began to realize that that was not just me, but that was a common thing. So it, again, who doesn't need more joy in their lives? Or we might even say in natural history engenders goofiness in some cases. But it fosters an expanded sense of self. We might say a sense of ecological self. And tied in with that is this idea of compassion, which again literally means feeling with. When we're out in the world, we can have that sense of compassion, again, something that we're in dire need for more of. And I would suggest that it fosters hope. Because of similar reasons, being in the world and the sense of beauty, the sense of exhilaration, and also for those who are inclined to be trying to design new technologies and so on, examples. How does that desert plant get by here? Maybe we can use that as a model for how we build a house, et cetera, which is hopeful. So, and to go through then the topic of this series, reciprocal healing, is that natural history heals. And the word heal and the word whole with a W have the same root. So for a long time, our languages have recognized that wholeness and healing are intertwined. And as I said here, you know, when we love the world, we can love ourselves, and vice versa. So these the healing is reciprocal. So really quickly, so Bob mentioned that I had done this book, Nature, Love, Medicine. There's a copy up here if you want to take a glance at it later on. But I started putting this book together. It came out in 2017. I had done an earlier book, The Way of Natural History, in which I gathered a whole bunch of voices of people telling the stories of how natural history served them in their lives. But I decided that there was well, I was really happy with the way that came out, but it was a little bit of preaching to the choir, that we needed to also make a case for people who maybe don't even want to watch a bird or look at a butterfly or identify a flower, but they sure want to be healthy and they want to be happier. And so how can the practice of natural history help everybody, including you might say, the unconverted? And I started delving into the technical and academic literatures of psychology and medical science and so on. And it kind of blew my mind how much stuff was coming out so quickly. I couldn't keep up with it all. So these are just some of the kinds of things, and I'll go through a couple of them, that studies on immersion in nature have helped reduce depression, strengthen immune systems, you know, cognitive functioning, and so on and so on and so on. And these are studies that were done in very, very traditional scientific ways, measuring physiological responses and so on. This isn't just woo-woo stuff that people say, oh, it makes me feel better, although not to say that that's invalid. So for example, one study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most respected scientific journals in the world, that immersion in nature reduces brooding, or what they called morbid rumination. I think sounds like a band from Seattle back in the day or something. That people basically focus less on the negative aspects of their life. It helps us feel better. And many, many studies on how immersion in nature, and so in most cases, to be clear, this is just talking about being outside. It's not talking about, in some cases it's talking about exercise, but it's mostly just talking about getting out. But all sorts of studies talking about how immersion in nature reduces depression and anxiety. This one study talked about promoting kinder behaviors of generosity and trust of one another, so building better social worlds. This idea of forest bathing, which is basically just being out in nature, that actually, again, with very empirical scientific studies documenting that this was enhancing immune functions in the medical sense, and they were measuring very specific things like anti-cancer proteins and so on and so forth. So this was a very interesting one where this was a study that they looked at a whole bunch of different neighborhoods in Toronto, Ontario, and if people just living in a neighborhood that had more trees, their physiological responses were the equivalent. If they lived in a neighborhood with a few more trees, they were functionally, you might say, younger and richer in a financial sense, which was fascinating. Another one was following a group of people in the wilderness that just 4 days there was a 50% improvement in creative problem-solving abilities, and so on and so forth. So just in 2019, a group of, I think it's 26 co-authors there, of some of the most preeminent people studying this kind of stuff from all over the world, came out with this paper, sort of a review paper, looking at a lot of this stuff, and they highlighted 3 consensus statements. And the first you see here is what we've already talked about, the increased sense of psychological well-being. So that's, again, from all these different studies from all over the world. The second consensus statement is that there's a reduction of risk factors and less burden of certain specific types of mental illness. And then the third consensus statement, which is the sad one, is that they were noticing that opportunities for this very type of healing experience was disappearing in too many places. Back to the importance of conservation. So, and just to show you this, so this is still like stuff that just keeps coming out. And just in the last year, and the lower paper here just came out about literally a month ago, I just happened to see it. These are both about getting physical exercise in natural environments is better for mental health than if you do the exact same cardio routine indoors. So that kind of makes sense. But notice that I want to be clear that all of these studies I've talked about, none of them are specifically talking about doing natural history. They're all just really talking about getting outside. So I want to propose a hypothesis that what you do when you go out there makes a difference. And I would love to see some of these folks go out and do a study where, and measure these very same things if while we're out there, we're looking down the throat of a flower and counting how many stamens there are, or we're identifying a bird, we're doing the practice of natural history. And I would be willing to bet a lot of money that those numbers would be even more favorable. So I'm throwing this out into the world. Okay, quickly, reciprocal healing is I just want to look just mention briefly, like, how do we reciprocate? Because it's a term that's used a lot, reciprocity, but what do we mean by that? So here, the first thing that came into my mind was borrowing this term from Waldorf education, actually, which is they talk about education for the head, hands, and heart. And I think that's actually a very useful kind of summary. But this was just a recent brainstorm. There's nothing comprehensive about this, but to say that there's lots of ways of reciprocating with the world, with the gifts of the world. Some of that is direct work with our hands. Like Jesse led a program just the other day with maybe some of you in the room, doing handwork out, doing stream restoration and so on. That's clearly is reciprocating. But things like, growing healthy food, things like being engaged in politics and policy and helping do what the poet Gary Snyder once referred to as those funny little things down at the courthouse that make a lot of difference in the world. Also, just doing the work like happens here of growing understanding, growing compassion and receptivity to what the world has to offer us, and nurturing a sense of explicit gratitude. And really just nurturing healthy relationships of all kinds. So being a parent and raising a good person is part of the work of reciprocating with the world. So there's lots and lots of ways, and we could keep adding to this list. But I just wanted to kind of think, just address that a little bit, because it's easy to just talk about this. It's all reciprocal without really talking about what that means. And natural history, the practice of natural history, encompasses many of these things, and it motivates many of these things. Okay, so thank you for your patience, or for your sitting here. And I know there's a limit to how long we want to sit in these chairs, so I'm going to just close by telling a little story. And this is, again, from my introductory essay in this book, Nature, Love, Medicine, which is called Our Deepest Affinity, is the name of my essay. And this is just the last couple paragraphs of that essay. It's the final night of a week-long group backpack into red earth. After a late supper and lingering conversation, two of us lay back, stunned into horizontality by the night sky. In this canyon of smooth stone, deep in the heart of one of the largest roadless areas in North America, our eyes gaze intently where they rarely focus, upward. The dome of stars is phenomenally textured, with vast depth visible within the Milky Way. Swirls and eddies of pulsating light contrast with the velvet black of infinity. Arcing downward, the gaudiest shooting star I've ever seen blazes brilliantly for a full 20 seconds as it angles toward Earth. Its long tail remains gleaming even after I close my eyes. It's a brief interlude of extended psyche as our minds momentarily stretch beyond their usual boundaries, a sense of delighted union with the larger forces of not only this world of green, but the universe that surrounds it, and better for sharing it with a close friend. Lying face up to the heavens, dazzled, humbled, entranced by the endless array of light, provokes a fundamental feeling of kinship with people through times and cultures. We all look up and wonder. And on these sandstone slabs in front of this long-inhabited alcove, near 1,000-year-old petroglyphs in discarded clay pots, we see the same framing of the universe as our ancestors, unchanged through human time, but for the occasional steady scoot of a tiny satellite's light. In these singular moments, we are the outbreath of galaxies. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was wonderful. So I suppose there's some questions, and I believe, Tom, you have time to take some questions. I'm going to ask you, Tom, to repeat the question so that the
Sure.
viewers
Sure.
in the electrons have a chance
Right.
to interact.
And also, I would say, I know sometimes it's hard to get down here, and if anybody needs to leave, feel free, whenever you need to, don't feel, you won't be offending me. So any questions or comments? Yeah.
I think it was wonderful. You saw me, my head was nodding.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And I wrote my master's thesis on nature, and
Oh.
I really learned a lot from it as well, from that experience. But I really enjoyed the presentation. It really brought it all together.
Thank you so much. And for the electrons, she's saying that her background her thesis was on nature-related topics, and just a sense of appreciation thank you, appreciate that. Yeah. And I did notice you're nodding, so. Anybody else?
Can we get your book here? Can you
Yes. Yes. Yeah. In fact, this one right here belongs to the Institute, but there's a couple more up there. Yeah. Yeah. And if they run out, they also carry it at Peregrine. Yeah. Mark.
You mentioned the studies of being out in nature and the healing that occurs in that.
Mm-hmm.
And have you reached out to anybody about doing a study on, incorporating the natural history component of that, as you mentioned? I know it sounds like it's kind of new for you with what's coming up, because you said all these things are going on.
Yeah. So to repeat the question, so Mark was asking me if I personally had reached out to the community of sort of researchers in psychology and medicine and so on about trying to look more carefully at natural history as one of the variables, we might say. And I guess the answer would be a little bit informally. As Bob mentioned before, we were deeply involved in coordinating and instigating this national gathering of people about this very subject of reciprocal healing. So we hosted a national, we called it a confluence instead of a conference. It was over at a retreat center near Sedona back in and actually some people here were there. And that was in November of 2019, and it was a great success and brought all sorts of energy and excitement, and there was lots of great connections made. And then what happened a couple months later? And so some of that stuff got sort of held up, and so I have been trying to sort of spread that idea, and certainly, and not just me, but other people I know, the idea of it's not just about getting outside, it's also what you do. So there's a wonderful organization, for example, called the Children in Nature Network that has done a great job of advocating for, let's get children outside. And that's a fantastic thing. But they tend to stop there. It's like getting them out, and then what do they do out there is, there's a lot of different things. And so I think there's lots of sort of vehicles like that. And so I've been trying to do it somewhat in more informal ways. And then Bob also mentioned that Laura Sewell and I co-guest edited this special issue of the journal Ecopsychology, and so that's we're trying to do some of that too. But yeah. But I hope that will spread. So, yeah, Christine.
I've just been noticing, I think you mentioned that this whole importance and just the value of the practice of natural history preferred, and that it's kind of coming back around again after maybe the abstract theoretical parts. I've just been noticing even, I think there was a Canvas PBS piece just the other evening about a museum of natural history
In New York?
in New York, a curator who was really trying to kind of open things up, and this was just a bunch of kids were running into some three-dimensional exhibit that looked amazing. So I just was wondering, what other ways too are you
Yeah, so the question is about in what ways are we seeing changes, or sort of the, you might say, the rejuvenation of natural history, because I mentioned that it had sort of gotten marginalized. So we'll just, to add to, so for example, before World War II, there was a book called The Handbook of Nature Study. It was written by a woman named Anna Comstock. And it was like, it was required reading for teacher training throughout much of the US. I mean, this was like, it was not seen as anything, you know, weird or marginal at all. But then World War II happened, of course, turned the world upside down. And then shortly after that, some of the technologies that were developed, you know, there was two big changes in particular that led to a lot of the marginalization. One was the space race, and that, and of course that was thrilling and captivating. And then in the biological sciences was the development of molecular technology to be able to look deeper and deeper into cells, and the discovery of DNA and all of that stuff. And so that captivated a whole lot of attention, and all deservedly so. But in the academy, i.e. academia, in many ways, then they scrambled to get people doing that stuff. And up until very recently, at large research universities in this country, especially in this country, if somebody who had been a professor teaching field biology for many years, when they finally decided to retire, they would almost never be replaced with another field biologist. It became to get another molecular lab or so on. And I believe, and I'm not alone in this, that part of the motivation of university administrators was because that's where the money is. So it doesn't take very much money to do natural history, you know, a few pairs of binoculars and a hand lens. And so if that's what you're bringing into the university, you're not enriching the coffers. Whereas if you're saying, well, I need a gas chromatograph and I need this and this and this, then that starts, you know, so that's definitely a factor. So that's all preambled. I haven't answered your question yet. In the ecological sciences, we definitely have begun to see a swinging back. And just a story, so I was involved in starting another organization which this institute grew directly out of. It was called the Natural History Network. And back in the late, what do you call it, the first decade of 2009, we made a proposal, a few of us made a proposal for a symposium at the annual meeting of the Ecological Society of America. The ESA is the largest, it isn't just Americans, it's a global organization. It's the largest gathering of professional ecologists that takes place in the world. And we were initially told by the organizing committee, like, well, that's not really the cutting edge of ecology anymore. And so they kind of downgraded us. They let us do it, but then they gave it a less imposing title than symposium, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the details aren't important, but to say that was then one of the most well-attended things of the whole conference, and including, National Science Foundation funding came out of that, et cetera, et cetera. And that same meeting, a number of us, we started a natural history section of ESA, which within 2 or 3 years was one of the fastest growing sections within it. So all these, like, I'll never forget this one well-known ecologist came running up to me after that, and he said, "This is why I became an ecologist 30 years ago, and nobody has talked about it since." So the interest is there, and pretty quickly, and I'm happy to say that organization, which I ended up getting pretty involved with, was very receptive and turn and change. And so that's one place that I've seen a lot of change. And when professional societies like that shift gears, then it has ramifications back, into the academies that feed it and so on. So that, there's other examples, but that's certainly the one that I've been experienced with. And whenever you guys feels like you need to stop things, but I'm happy to keep.
We have time for one more question. All right, it looks like that's in there. Will you hang around for a little bit?
I'll be happy to hang around if other things strike you. So, and there's a wonderful jewelry show in there, yeah. So.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.